Hi there and welcome to the next lesson on the research methods topic. So today's lesson we're going to be focusing on achieving three main learning objectives. These are to firstly describe what a longitudinal study is, to then explain the advantages and disadvantages of longitudinal studies, and then to evaluate the usefulness of longitudinal studies when conducting sociological research. So to begin with, I firstly want you to write in the red box what you think a longitudinal study is. And I don't expect you to actually know the answer to this question, as I wouldn't be surprised if many of you haven't actually heard the word longitudinal before. But I want you to think about what the word longitudinal might sound like and how that can then lend itself to an idea of what a longitudinal study might be. So if you could just pause me as you complete this task, just by writing a few ideas of what you think a longitudinal study might be. Okay, great. So hopefully you've managed to come up with some ideas about what a longitudinal study might be. And I just want to introduce you here to a definition that I've put, which is a longitudinal study refers to research that is done over a long period of time. For example, interviewing participants at regular intervals through their childhood in order to see development. So this idea that a longitudinal study is research done over a long period of time. For example, if we are looking at this notion of childhood in order to see development, we might choose to interview a child at the age of 6, then again at the age of 9, then again at the age of 12, and then again at the age of 14, to see how they have developed in different ways. So well done if you had something similar, this idea of longitudinal studies being something's done over a long period of time. So let's look into this idea a bit further. So we've sort of established this idea that a longitudinal study studies a group of people over a long period of time. But my question to you is, why would a researcher be interested in using longitudinal studies to conduct research? So what is the use of a longitudinal study? So again, I'd like you to just pause me as you maybe write your answer to this in the circle below. Great, so hopefully you've all managed to come up with an idea for that. And something that I've got here is longitudinal studies are really useful because they help track changes such as economic circumstances, maybe even social attitudes that have changed. So it's this idea that it helps us identify social change. And this is particularly useful if we want to, for example, maybe research how an individual born into a working class family then progresses throughout their life. Do they stay as a working class citizen, or do they progress up the social ladder and experience economic change? Do their social attitudes change? Do they now sort of adopt more middle class norms? And how does that process happen? How does it happen that an individual who was born into a working class family progresses through life and in adulthood has managed to sort of change social classes, progress up the social ladder, and now recognised as a member of the middle class? Longitudinal studies are really useful for us to sort of identify how this process happens through the study of an individual or a group of individuals over a long period of time. And a really good case study here to sort of illustrate this is a documentary called 7 Up. So 7 Up is a documentary which is of high sociological interest. And it was filmmakers interviewing 7-year-olds in 1964, and then the same filmmakers revisited the same individuals every 7 years, and the participants are now in their 50s. So from the age of 7 and every 7 years up until the age of 50, these participants were interviewed about their life, and this meant that the researchers were able to get to know the participants at each sort of stage of life, and then that meant they could sort of track the different changing attitudes, beliefs and social classes of each of these participants. So there were 14 participants, 10 boys and 4 girls, and all of these participants were from different socio-economic backgrounds, and this simply means different social classes. And the researchers wanted to find out how their attitudes, beliefs, and social classes changed, or maybe didn't change, over time. So here you've got two clips, and I'd like you to watch them both. And these clips are, one is the trailer for 7-Up, and the other one is a clip of 7-Up. And I want you to watch both and complete the table on the next slide, which is asking you to identify the PET, so practical, ethical, and theoretical strengths and weaknesses of using longitudinal studies based on what you gather from these two video clips. So let's just sort of fast forward a bit to the table on the next slide. So you'll see that you have got practical, ethical, and theoretical advantages and disadvantages. And these blue boxes here, they won't appear on your screen, but they are simply here to give you prompts that you could use for when you do come to complete the table. So consider when watching the trailers, the following prompts. Do you reckon that the longitudinal studies might have been difficult to carry out? Do you think that these longitudinal studies you're about to watch would have been time consuming? And would they have been expensive? When looking at the ethical factors, I want you to consider, is there an invasion of privacy here? Okay, so remember DRIP. P is privacy. Is there an invasion of privacy? Is there a possibility of going native? And how might going native present itself as an ethical issue? Is there informed consent? And then theoretical, if it is over a long period of time, it will produce in-depth data. What strength is this? Are you able to gain an understanding? Can the research be generalised? So that's asking you, is the research representative of an entire population? Now these prompts are merely prompts, guys. They're not exhaustive. You will identify many more advantages and disadvantages as you watch the clips. So I'm going to ask that you think about the drip and tramp analogy. So when we've got tramp, when we're looking at practical issues, I want you to consider time, resources, access, money, and the personal skills of the researcher. And then when you're thinking about the ethical issues, I want you to consider deception, risk to participants, informed consent, and this notion of privacy, which you've already discussed. And when looking at theoretical, I want you to consider things such as reliability, representativeness, and validity. So watch those clips and pause me as you complete this table. Okay, great. So hopefully you've now all managed to have a chance to fill in that table based on what you have gathered from the 7-Up trailer and clip. So let's move on now, and I'll mark that piece of work, that table, when you submit to show my homework. Okay, so now we have another table which is still focusing on longitudinal studies, and it's a strengths or weaknesses task. So what you've got on the left-hand side is a selection of statements. The next column along is asking you whether the statement is a strength or a weakness of longitudinal studies. The third column along is slightly more tricky. It's asking you to identify whether the strength or weakness is a practical, ethical, or theoretical factor. And then even trickier, the final column is asking you to justify your answer, to justify why you've said that it's a strength or a weakness. So the first one I've done for you as an example. So let's just take a look at that together. The statement is that longitudinal studies are expensive. Well, of course, this idea of it being expensive then lends itself to being a weakness. And then I've got to decide whether being expensive, so the cost of it, is a practical, ethical, or theoretical factor. Now, to consider this, I wrote tramp down on my piece of paper. So time, resources, access, money, and the personal skills of researcher. And then, of course, the notion of it being expensive lends itself to M, this notion of money. So I know that the cost of it lends itself to the practical factor of money. And then when I'm justifying my answer, when I'm saying why is it going to be expensive? So how is it going to be expensive and why is that a weakness? I've said, well, if we want to have respondents who are going to allow us to interview them over the course of their life at several different intervals, then it's very likely that we're going to have to pay that respondent as a form of compensation for the slight inconvenience that it may cause, and also as an incentive to encourage them to be part of our research project. So we're going to have to pay the respondents at lots of different intervals over the course of the research period. In addition to that, in the same way that we're going to have to pay our respondents, we're also going to have to pay our interviewers. So we're paying the respondents and researchers over a long period of time. So it's not a cost-effective or cheap research method. So the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 statements, I'm going to ask you to do independently, and you're going to be doing the exact same thing. So you're going to be identifying whether it's a strength or a weakness, telling me whether the strength or weakness you've identified is a practical, ethical, or theoretical factor, and then justifying your answer for me. Although this column is a challenge, I want you all to attempt to answer this column. I don't want anyone leaving it blank. I know that you're all more than capable of doing this. So if you could just pause me as you complete this table and then press resume again when you are done. Okay, great, well done. So hopefully you've all managed to finish completing that table. Again, we won't go through it now, but as you submit to show my homework, I'll mark it and give you all individualised feedback. Okay, so the final activity for this lesson is introducing you to a item case study, which you'll see in yellow. And then following the case study, you've got 2 exam questions. One is a 2 marker, which I've said is tricky, and the other is a 4 marker, which I've said is slightly trickier. And in your exams, when you do come to do your GCSEs, and in all the mocks that we'll be doing following, you will have item questions. And then, you'll have items such as this one here, and then questions following on from the item. And when you come across these sorts of questions, you'll be required to read the item and then use that item to answer the questions. And that means you're going to be having to refer to the item to support the answers you're giving to the exam questions. And we're going to practice that a bit now. So let's read this together. Item A. National Child Development Study. Through each stage of your life, you have adapted to a changing Britain, making your generation a very special one. The purpose of the National Child Development Study, also known as NCDS, is to document your experiences and the lessons they teach us so we can help improve the lives of future generations. We share what we learn from your experiences with the government and service providers. Our aim is to inform policies and services that will help make life better for your generation and younger ones too. The NCDS is the second in a long line of cohort studies following generations of Britons born in 1946, 1958, 1970, 1989 to 90, and 2000 to 2001. By comparing the experiences of different generations, we can track how life in the UK is changing. So here we have a longitudinal study where researchers have interviewed generations of people born in several different years and have compared the experiences of different generations. And this was done in order to help inform policies and services as a means of making life better for younger generations. So it was used to sort of highlight and identify maybe factors that made life slightly challenging for individuals. So looking at things such as health, wealth, family, education, employment, so on and so forth, and use that data to then help inform social policy as a means of improving the lives of individuals. And the 2 questions that you've got in response to this study is firstly asking you from item A, identifying one strength of using longitudinal studies. And secondly is asking you from item A, identify and describe one ethical issue that the researcher would need to consider when investigating children's lives. And you've got the sentence starters here to help you. And you'll see that I have actually incorporated the item, sentence starters referring to the item, sorry, into these answers for you to give, because it's very crucial that when you do these, you always refer to the item. So when you have an item question, you actually have to bring the item into your answer. So I'd like you to have a go at answering these questions. If you find that you're confused or you have any issues, please just drop me an email and we can talk about it further. But I hope that these sentence starters help you to answer these questions. So well done for this lesson. Best of luck answering these PEQs, and we'll see you soon for the next lesson. Bye bye.